Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I am Brian Park with the Maine Motor Transport Association, and I'll serve as the moderator for this webinar. We're fortunate to have Tozier and Stacey Neumann with us from Murray Plum and Murray out of Portland. They graciously offered to put together this webinar free of charge for our members because many of you are starting to have questions about the employer's role in the rollout of the vaccine. As you all know, Maine is currently in phase 1B of the vaccine rollout with well-documented supply issues giving everyone problems. But we're hearing that phase 1C is right around the corner, and it's eventually going to include more and more people. And by the summer, we're hoping that they'll start to vaccinate the general population. A couple of housekeeping items before I hand it off to Ali and Stacey. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website, hopefully later today. If you know someone who might benefit from this information, we'd like for you to feel free to send them to our website, and it'll direct you from there. We also do have the Q&A feature active, and the way we'd like to handle questions is for you to type them into the Q&A as we go. And I'll do my level best to monitor this and bring them to Ali and Stacey's attention. There will be time at the end for questions, which will give everyone time to digest all of the information and formulate your questions. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Ali and Stacey.
Great. Thank you, guys. I'm Ali, and this is my colleague Stacey, and we appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all about such hot topics and important issues that you're probably all thinking about right now in terms of the vaccine coming out and what you should be doing in your workplaces. So the purpose of this presentation is to help you think through some of the issues and keep in mind that these are new issues for all of us, including employment attorneys, because we've never had this particular, virus in the world. So we've never had this play out in workplaces. So a lot of what you're going to hear today is our best understanding of things and risks to consider. So keep that in mind, that we might not have all the answers. So with that, I'll get into it. Okay. So first thing that I just want to go over is the vaccines that are out there right now. You probably all know about the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, and of course, Johnson & Johnson has petitioned the FDA for emergency use authorization as well. So we might have 3 vaccines, but we'll talk about the 2 that are out there now. And just to give a little overview as we go into this discussion. So the authorization, the emergency use authorization that the FDA has given, of course, is not full authorization like we would expect to see in our normal food or things that we consume in stores. What they have done, they have just assessed the known and potential benefits, and they've weighed them against the known and potential risks of these vaccines, because the pandemic is so severe and because we need to act. So these are things to keep in mind, that there's still a lot that we don't know about these vaccines. The 2 that we have out there, they both require 2 shots, and again, there's just a lot we don't know. So we are figuring out as we go, a lot of us. There is, of course, a plan to vaccinate Americans, and in Maine, the states have different individual plans with phases. And in Maine, as Brian talked about, there are different phases in place. It's been a little bit difficult for people to get vaccinated, although it's going steady, and more and more people are getting vaccinated. But this is an issue that we're seeing all across the United States in terms of people who want the vaccines to be able to get them. So even though we're talking about what you can do in your workplaces or what you're thinking about doing, just keep in mind that it might be a while before all of your employees are actually able to be getting the vaccines. And of course, the goal as a country is to reach herd immunity, which will stop the rapid spread of the virus. And scientists say that that's somewhere between 50 and 70% of the population that's how many need to be vaccinated. So of course we have quite a lot in front of us in terms of getting everyone vaccinated. So there have been almost 500,000 deaths in the country, and so and we don't know all of the reasons why all of those people have died from COVID. So even though some might think that there's a low risk if I'm a certain age group of dying from the vaccine, or sorry, of dying from COVID or having health complications from COVID, there's still just as a lot we don't know because it's so new still. And so that goes into play when you're an employer thinking about the vaccinations of your employees. A lot of employees might think, I don't need to get vaccinated. I can just get the virus and then I'll be okay because I have friends that have been okay. But what I'm trying to say is we don't really know, because there's a lot of people that have died from the virus that were supposedly in that percentage of people that were supposed to be okay. So it's there's just a lot out there, and we are living in a world of risk assessments and percentages, as we probably have all been navigating when it comes to if we can see our family members and our friends. So we're all very familiar with this. In terms of employers and their general duty, employers do have a legal duty to maintain a safe work environment for their employees. And that means that they need to be taking be making efforts and taking measures to keep the workplace free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Obviously, as we've been talking about, COVID-19 is a contagious virus, and it has the potential to cause serious physical harm or death. So employers are taking all the measures that they can to keep the workplace safe, and that of course can include the vaccine, to try to get employers to take the vaccine. These are the different ways that might make an employee less of a threat of passing on COVID-19. Of course, the safety measures that are already in place. Hopefully you've been having your employees wear masks and do social distancing. Of course, there's the scientists say that actually getting COVID and recovering from it is a way to be less of a threat, but there's still a lot we don't know about that. And if you can get it again after you've already had it. So there's just still a lot we don't know. And then getting one of the two vaccines, maybe 3 soon, these are the ways that your employees can be less of a threat, and things that you need to be thinking about as you're trying to maintain that safe workplace that we just talked about. And again, there's just a lot that is still being studied about this. So the government, of course, suggests that if you get COVID-19 and recover from it, that would be riskier health-wise to the average American than getting the vaccine. And because some employees are concerned about getting the vaccine. There's, as I said before, there's not a lot of data. We are going it's been not even a year since the whole everything as we knew it changed. So there hasn't been a lot of time, but for obvious reasons, the employers should not be encouraging their employees to get a deadly virus and then try to recover from it. So the vaccine is the safer of those two methods. Talking a little bit about the Pfizer vaccine, the data I have, in case you're interested here on this slide, is just how many participants took place in that study or participated in that study. And from all of those participants, they found that 95% of the people who had the vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, were protected from COVID-19. And for the other one, it was 94.1. So those are pretty high percentages for the two vaccines. And again, just a caution that this is based on short-term data, and there's a lot that we don't know. And in the beginning of the pandemic, for instance, we were hearing that we shouldn't be wearing masks and that didn't do anything. But then we learned that actually it was very important to wear masks. So, we're not 100% sure what they're going to be saying about the vaccines. Hopefully the science will continue to show that it is that effective. But other things to keep in mind about the vaccines is that what certain things weren't studied in these trials, like whether or not the participants could still carry that virus and spread it to other people even after getting the vaccine. And note that when you do get one of the vaccines, the FDA has a requirement that you need to get a notice that tells you that you don't actually have to take the vaccine. And that might contradict. We're going to talk in a minute about whether or not employers can mandate a vaccine, and they can, and I'll go into it. So that might seem contradictory. Well, the FDA is saying that I don't have to take it, but my employer is saying I can. That FDA requirement is what it's trying to say is that there's no federal mandate to take the vaccine. And again, more things will become clear, so it could become a federal mandate. We don't know. Here are some things to consider from the employee's perspective. And I think it's always good practice for employers to take a minute and get into the shoes of their employees and think about what they're going through. So some of your employees might be wary about getting one of the vaccines, for the reasons we discussed. There are only so many people in the trials. It hasn't been that long. They might be uncomfortable about that. They might feel uncomfortable because they might have a generalized fear of vaccines in general and think it's unsafe, but don't have much to support that. They might feel that the vaccine isn't necessary because they already had COVID-19 and they recovered from it. They also might have underlying health conditions, and those might cause them to be wary of taking the vaccine. They might have been spoken to by their doctors about not getting the vaccine. And we're going to talk about the protections that the law has in place for these employees, which is very important for employers to understand. They also might have a sincerely held religious belief against getting the vaccine, which is, again, something that's protected by the law. And we'll talk about that. So one thing I want to dig into here in this presentation is the guidance from the EEOC that it issued on December 16th. And this is the federal agency that presents information for employers around the whole country to understand and listen to and abide by. So it's important to listen to the EEOC. And it helps employers understand how to maintain that duty to meet their obligations under the law to maintain a safe workplace. And keep in mind that the guidance from the EEOC and from public health authorities is likely to change as the pandemic evolves. And I put here on this slide, there are some helpful resources if you're interested and haven't yet gone to the CDC's website for businesses. They have FAQs there that are really informative, and they're updated regularly. So it's a good idea to put that on your favorites tab and to make sure that you are checking in and understand the latest guidance. And I also talked about the EEOC has a publication about preparedness in the pandemic, and that's also something I suggest you read. So here are some conclusions that the EEOC made in its guidance on December 16th, and I'm going to go through that. So first, the vaccine is not a medical exam. That's what they said, and that's important because if it was a medical exam under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that would require that would put certain obligations on the employer, and so because it's not a medical exam, it makes it essentially easier for the employer. And also requiring proof of the vaccine is also not a medical examination under the ADA. So again, this means that you don't need to demonstrate if you're asking your employees to take the vaccine or to give proof of the vaccine. You don't need to demonstrate that is related to that employee's job or consistent with business necessity. the ADA applies to employers that have 15 or more employees. However, there's a caveat to that. Even though the EEOC said it doesn't, it's not a medical examination, the EEOC did say that the pre-screening questions that employers might ask could cross that line into the ADA. And then they, in those, what that means is if an employer is, let's say, offering the vaccine at the work site and asking questions before giving the vaccine to the employees, and those questions elicit information about a disability of one of the employees, that could cross the line, because now the employer is learning information about the disability of their employees, and that isn't allowed unless you can meet that test of business necessity and job relatedness. So it's not that you can't do it, it's that you want to be very careful and consider that. So those are things to keep in mind. And a lot of these things, this is an overview, and if you have specific questions, I am here, and Stacey is here to help you, as are other employment attorneys out there, and they can go, we can go with you through your facts and situation and give you specific guidance as you try to understand these things as they apply to your own workplace. So again, under the ADA, it would need to be job related and consistent with business necessity if you mandate the vaccine. If so, sorry, let me say that again. If you're mandating the vaccine and you're saying, which is allowed with some caveats. So if you say, okay, all my employees need to get vaccinated, but then you are asking these pre-screening questions, then you have to be careful about that job related and consistent with business necessity part of the compliance in those pre-screening questions. But if you were to not mandate the vaccine and say, we're making it voluntary, which is what I suggest is the best practice, and I'll get into that, then you don't have to worry about that threshold and meeting that standard, because the employees wouldn't be required to be answering those pre-screening questions. They could decide not to do that. So if it's voluntary, then essentially you don't have as many hurdles under the law to meet. So what does this mean? It means that, again, we already kind of said this, but if it's voluntary, those pre-screening questions, you don't have to show that they're job related and consistent with business necessity. And another, the point here about maybe you can get enough coverage with a voluntary program, if you make it voluntary, then maybe your employees, enough people will want to get the vaccine so that you have a safe workplace and you have enough people vaccinated. So that also depends on how many people would actually get the vaccine if you offered it voluntarily. So let's say that you decide to mandate it and you're doing the pre-screening questions and disability related topics come up. Now you're in this zone that we just talked about of job related and consistent with business necessity that the ADA says you have to be. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So for the vaccine or the pre-screening questions to be job related and consistent with business necessity, the employer must have a reasonable belief that the vaccine process and or getting the employee vaccinated, based on objective evidence that the unvaccinated employee would pose a direct threat to the health and safety of him or herself or others that could not be eliminated or reduced by a reasonable accommodation. So I know that's a lot. We'll get into that. So the direct threat, whether an unvaccinated employee would pose a direct threat, that's what you'd have to consider as an employer. So to determine whether or not an employee is a direct threat, you've got to look at these 4 factors: the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and imminence of the potential harm. So here, the potential harm is COVID-19 spreading to your other workers. And of course, there are ways that would be more severe depending on the situation. So if you have an employee that's mostly not interacting with other people in your workplace, then that risk isn't as high, then that's not as much of a direct threat. But if you have an employee who's unvaccinated, who's interacting with people frequently, and it's hard to be socially distant from others, then of course that increases and they become more of a direct threat. If you have an employee that can work remotely and all of their job functions can be met working remotely, then that lessens the direct threat. So you can see how this is not a one size fits all. This really does require some analysis into your specific situation if you're going to mandate the vaccine, and you're going to have to show that those pre-screening questions, are job related and consistent with business necessity. An additional factors that might come into the analysis as you're doing that would be, again, we spoke about this, but how many other employees are vaccinated? How many are actually in the office? Can the employee work remotely? And so we've been talking about how, yes, you can mandate the vaccine, but also, we talked about some of the considerations, but other things you must keep in mind if you do mandate the vaccine are the rights that employees have under the ADA and Title VII. And we'll go into that now. So the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, this applies specifically in this situation to employees who refuse to get the vaccine that you're mandating, if you do that, due to a disability. And if that's the case, then that employee falls under the ADA. And here's a little flow chart that I have put together to help you visualize what you might need to do if this happens to you. So if you are an employer who mandates the vaccine because you're trying to keep the workplace as safe as possible, but one of the employees says that no, I can't get the vaccine because I have disability, and here's the doctor's note, I can't, it's too much of a risk for me, that kind of thing. So the first thing that you would do is you would question, is the employee a direct threat if they do not get the vaccine? So if and if they're not, and we already talked about those factors for direct threat. If you decide after analyzing that they're not actually a direct threat to your company, if they don't get the vaccine, then you don't give them the vaccine. You don't mandate that they get the vaccine. If you decide that they are a direct threat and you are very concerned and you really want to make sure this employee with the disability still gets the vaccine, then the law requires you to go through the interactive process. So some might think that you could just fire somebody for not wanting to get the vaccine if you mandated it, but that's not true. And if you do that, you are at risk for being sued and for facing some serious legal challenges. So that's why I want to make sure everybody understands what the ADA protections are. And so part of those ADA protections for employees are to be able to engage in the interactive process with their employer. So that what does that look like? Well, you need to ask yourself, and you need to talk to the employee and figure out, can you accommodate this request without undue hardship? And this is the same kind of analysis you do, for any ADA accommodation. So you probably have gone through this before if you've had employees that have had disabilities and have requested reasonable accommodations, but you need to go through that analysis. And that, if you have trouble with that or you want advice, that's a good time to call an employment lawyer to really help you think about it. If you decide after this interactive process that you cannot accommodate this request, this accommodation of not getting the vaccine without it being an undue hardship, then again, I would think you should consult with an employment counsel on your options instead of just going forward and firing the person, just to make sure that you're really protecting yourself and you have the right documentation in place and you're prepared if you get challenged. If you do decide after this interactive process that you can accommodate them, and then it's not an undue hardship to do that. For instance, maybe the employee can work remotely, and it's not a huge hardship to your company to do that, then they don't get the vaccine. The next protection that we talked about is Title VII, and that's for religious beliefs. So if you mandate the vaccine and an employee comes and says, I don't want to get the vaccine because I have a sincerely held religious belief against getting vaccines, and then you need to go through a process as well, because the federal law Title VII protects people with sincerely held religious beliefs. So here's another flow chart to hopefully help visualize this process. So the question is, do you have an objective basis for questioning the religious nature or the sincerity of the employee's belief, practice, or observance? So, if it seems that the employee is just scared of the vaccine, and they don't really have a basis for saying that they have an objection that's religious in nature, then it would be likely that you'd have an objective basis for questioning them, and then you'd have to analyze if an undue hardship exists. If an undue hardship exists for your company, and you'd also want to engage in dialogue to learn more about the objections that the employee is coming to you with, and then also consulting with employment counsel is a good idea in this situation as well, just to be really careful that you are protecting yourself as much as possible from litigation down the road. If you don't have an objective basis for questioning the religious nature or the sincerity of the employee's belief, then it's best to, and what you need to do is not give the vaccine, not mandate the vaccine. So that's a lot to keep in mind as you navigate what do I have to be aware of if I mandate the vaccine. And so for that reason, it's a lot of employers are actually making it voluntary and trying to incentivize their employees to get the vaccine, because if it's voluntary, then you don't have to do all of what we just discussed. You don't have to worry as much about that, because you're not mandating anything and you're letting employees decide. And employees have been through a lot, in the past year, since COVID changed everybody's life. And here's just some of the things that they've been struggling with, as you all well know, and have been facing these yourself. There's been lots of stress. People are exhausted with COVID protocols. Lots of people are feeling isolated, lonely, and scared. There's been tons of political anxiety. There's been grief. Maybe people have lost family members or friends due to the virus or other things. Most people have had changed circumstances in some way. And there's probably been health issues. So there's a lot that's going on, and it might be difficult for your employees if they're not given a choice about the vaccine. And so again, we were just thinking through whether you should mandate or not, and what kinds of considerations to keep in mind. But there is potential liability for non-compliance with those laws, with ADA and Title VII, and more, as I'll get into even more, as previously discussed. This is the more. So the other area that to keep in mind that could be an area of liability for employers who mandate the vaccine is under Osha, which is the federal agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. That OSHA, of course, is the agency that sets the standards for safety and has that duty or mandates that employers keep a safe workplace. And so there's a whistleblower protection under OSHA, which means if you're a whistleblower and you say there's an unsafe workplace practice or something's unsafe in the workplace, an employee could have protection under OSHA, and that could potentially come into play if they're refusing to get a mandated vaccine due to safety concerns. So this is an area that we as employment attorneys are keeping an eye out. We expect there's going to be lots of activity in these areas in the next year or two after vaccines become widely available, and employers are deciding what to do about that and how to keep their workplaces safe. So just take care and contact employment counsel, if you're dealing with these kinds of things. Other reasons, that might be best to make the vaccine voluntary, if you can, is again, it's uncharted territory, so there's risks involved that we don't even know. And most employees might get the vaccine if it's voluntary. So then you might not have any problem at all. And it might be a good idea to poll your employees and ask what they would do, or who might have already received the vaccine. And just to note that if you do that, and any kind of data you collect from employees or communications you have relating to vaccinations or relating to health, the health of the employees at all, or even the COVID symptoms, that all needs to be kept very confidential. And hopefully you already have practices in place for that, but it can't even be in the employee's personnel file. It needs to be in a separate file. And you need to make sure that only the people that absolutely have to see that information can. So privacy is very important, and especially with everyone being so digital now, it's really important to make sure you have good practices in place. And also, employees might not like it if they're forced to take the vaccine. It might be is something to consider in terms of how your employees might react to that. So some employers are offering incentives to their employees to make it, so that more employees get the vaccine, but they're not mandated to do it. And so some are giving paid time off, like maybe even 2 to 3 days extra paid time off in exchange for getting the vaccine. Employers can be creative, but there are some limits, as I'll talk about in just a minute, to what employers can do to incentivize for this. And then in terms of compensation, so if employers are going to mandate the vaccine, then they should definitely pay for that time, because any time that an employer, a non-exempt employee, and if you don't know what exempt and non-exempt is under the Fair Labor Standards Act, then that's a whole nother conversation that I'm happy to have with you if you want to follow up. But non-exempt employees are those that are hourly and must be paid overtime, and so they need to be paid for any work that they do that is for the benefit of the employer. The employer mandates that, so you'd want to make sure that if you're mandating it, you're definitely paying for that time that they're getting the vaccine. But it's also even for your salaried or exempt employees, it's best practice, I think, to make sure that the time spent getting the vaccine is compensated. It helps motivate them to get it anyway, and it creates goodwill. And again, I mentioned earlier, there are some limits on incentives. And if an employer is going to create incentives and basically give a benefit to an employee under for getting the vaccine, that's probably going to be a wellness plan under the ADA. And so what we have for guidance on that is, if it's a gift or if it's cash as a benefit, would need to be de minimis, or not seen by EEOC as too coercive. So that would be, hopefully that's self-explanatory, but the word de minimis is not really defined in this guidance that we have on this, but they've given examples of a water bottle or a gift card of modest value. And this is from the EEOC's wellness program rules that they have not gone into effect yet, but we expect that they will soon. So something to keep in mind. But paid time off is different, which is why I use that as an example. That's a little safer to give as an incentive. The other things you can do to help your employees be motivated to get the vaccine is educate them about the vaccine and the benefits. There's lots of information, as we know, going around, not all of it accurate. And so just trying to talk to them frankly about it and giving more information can be helpful. You could also bring the vaccination process on site and make it voluntary, make it easier for them. And a note about employees with disabilities who can't get the vaccine, you'd want to think about how you could offer them an equivalent of whatever benefit or incentive that you're offering to the other employees, to make sure that they're not being treated differently because they have disabilities. Keep that in mind. So this is a question that I got from Brian before talking before putting on this presentation for you guys. And the question is, if an employer requires the vaccine, are there liability implications for any adverse reactions or complications? And the answer is that if the employer is following the federal government's guidance, then it's very unlikely that the employer is going to be held liable to any kind of breach of duty, because it's widely understood that if you're following the guidance of the federal government and the CDC of best practices, then you're doing the best you can as an employer. You're being reasonable. And it would be hard to show that you're being negligent. So following the guidance of the EEOC, which we just went over, would be very important as well to show that you have been doing what you've been told to do. And if an employee questions you or sues you for that, that would be your defense. So, employees can always sue employers, even if they have no real reason to. They have a right to bring a claim, but it's important that you would have a good defense. So that's one reason we're doing this presentation, to help you think about that and prepare so you have good defenses. And it's also possible that if there were some kind of adverse reactions or complications, that workers' compensation would cover that. Is there any way to limit this liability? And as we talked about, making the vaccine voluntary instead of mandatory is helpful, because then you don't have to worry about complying with the things that we discussed. You obviously always have to be following the law, but it doesn't come into play in the same way as we just went over. And we think that you should always contact employment counsel if you have any questions, because some of these issues are really tricky and they require thoughtful analysis. And the other thing I wanted to say was just document. I mean, you can have conversations with your employees on the phone and then never follow up in an email. And then it becomes an issue later on, a year later, what was said. And you said, we had that phone call and we said this and that. And the employee might say, no, we never had that phone call, or no, that was never said. So, and this is something to keep in mind just in general for good employment practice, but following up and with email or even text messages, just make sure that you keep them. It's really important so that you can always prove in writing that you've been doing what you're supposed to do under the law. Is it different if the vaccines are delivered on site versus at a clinic that employers direct employers to? And this, there's not a lot of differences. Of course, if there's things to consider for each one, I made this little chart to help kind of visualize the differences. But if you bring the vaccinations on site, then it's easier for your employees to get them, and they might feel more inclined because it's right there. But also, if you're mandating it, then we talked about the pre-screening questions and the need to show the consistency, with business necessity and job relatedness. And the EEOC did say that if you mandate the vaccine but have your employees get the vaccine off-site and you have no contract with that off-site third party, then that the pre-screening questions you would not need to show that they were job related and consistent with business necessity under the ADA, because that would essentially be somebody else doing those questions and you as the employer wouldn't have access to that information. So that's just a caveat in the law to keep in mind. But again, there are benefits to making it voluntary, as you can see. And I have a little asterisk here that says, make sure employees know the process for how to object, whether it's on-site or off-site, that you're offering the vaccine. Because again, if an employee has a disability or a religious belief that protects them under the ADA, or if they, feel like it's unsafe under Osha potentially, they need a way to be able to object and to stand up for themselves and assert those rights. So it'd be important for you to make sure that they know how to do that, and hopefully they already have a process for requesting reasonable accommodations, but it's something to keep in mind. Keep records of everything. I'm going to say this twice because it's so important. So here's some more. I'm going to move a little bit from the vaccine just into more of what was in the EEOC guidance relating to COVID-19 in general, because this EEOC guidance is very helpful, and I want to make sure you guys understand it. So the EEOC says that individuals with the virus are a direct threat. And we talked about the 4 factors of a direct threat, but that's for whether or not, that was in relation to whether somebody should be vaccinated or not. This is if somebody has COVID-19, then the government says they are a direct threat. So you don't have to prove it. They just are by definition. So that means that you can take steps to screen and them to keep them out of the workplace. That's why you're able to take employees' temperatures. That's why you're able to ask them information about their health, because they are a direct threat to other people in your workplace. And so, of course, this is common sense, but it's worth repeating because it's so important to keep people safe. Employees who become ill with symptoms of COVID-19, even if they don't have a positive test to confirm it, they need to leave the workplace immediately. And you need to have a good system for that, to make sure that everyone is aware of that, and that they know that they need to report it as well if they know of another employee that has the symptoms, because employees with the symptoms of COVID cannot be around others in your workplace. And those proper protocols and good communication and good leadership are key here. And again, I mentioned this, but employers can measure an employee's body temperature. It's not a medical examination under federal law. But COVID-19 doesn't always, it doesn't always show up in terms of a temperature. You can have COVID and not have the symptoms. And that's what's so scary about this. So just something to keep in mind, which we all know, I'm sure, very well. So because it's so important that you do not have any employees in your workplace that have COVID-19, it's okay to require proof of a negative COVID test before you allow them back into the workplace. So I want to discuss what's not allowed. What can employers not do? You cannot require antibody testing before allowing employees to reenter the workplace. You cannot ask employees who are physically coming into the workplace whether they have family members who have COVID-19. And this might seem confusing to some of you. Why can't you ask if their family members have COVID-19? And it's because not everyone lives with their family members. And I'll talk more about that in a second. You cannot broadly disclose medical information about employees to others, and that's very important. So this needs to be extremely confidential if somebody has COVID and their identity. At the same time, employers have to balance that confidentiality with the need to make sure that people who have been in contact with that individual are notified and quarantined. And so this is a balancing act of confidential versus what's right to for safety of others. And so and so an employer will need to be very thoughtful about who really needs this information and how do we communicate with the right people so that we can protect identities but still get the right information shared. So that's definitely a challenge for employers nowadays to do that. And also you can't share whether or not different employees have been vaccinated or sorry, you can't share why an employee may not have been vaccinated. So if someone asks, why did that person not get the vaccine, that's confidential information. So what is allowed? Well, you can mandate that that employees get COVID-19 tests to see if they currently have it. You can ask whether employees have had contact with anyone diagnosed with COVID-19 or with anyone who has the associated symptoms, which would get at whether or not their family members do. I just talked about this a second ago, but you can share the name of the infected person or the symptomatic individual with those who need to know in order to contact, trace, and inform other people. So confidentiality, again, must be maintained to the greatest extent possible. And I already mentioned this, but I'll just say it again. The employee file can't contain anything related to the employee's medical information, including COVID and including vaccination records. So that needs to be kept separate. And make sure that the digital access, if you have it in a digital form, make sure that that's protected and not accessible accidentally to the wrong people. Some questions to consider as you're thinking about all of this and you're wondering, do I mandate it or do I make it voluntary? How many people will really take it? And is that going to be safe enough? Think about if you do mandate it and someone doesn't want to take it, are you prepared to terminate that person who refuses to get the vaccine? And of course, that's assuming that person doesn't have any of the legal protections that we previously discussed. So are you prepared to terminate that individual? How easy will it be for you to get a new person, a new employee in that position? And think about the costs that are associated with the recruiting and onboarding. So these are things to consider. Are you really going to follow through with that? Do your employees still have to wear masks if they're vaccinated? According to the current guidance, yes, they do. And again, we just don't know enough about it all right now. So do you have clear communication systems in place? This is another good question to consider because you want to prevent misinformation and gossip amongst your employees, which is hard to do sometimes. But if you have really clear communication and good leadership, then that can often be avoided. So at this point, I will ask Stacey to jump in. And Stacey, do you have anything to add or things that we should invite them to consider more of?
I think you did a great job. Thanks so much, Allie. That was really thorough, especially in this field, which is, largely unknown. So I think we just open it up to questions now.
Great.
So while people are contemplating their questions and putting them in right now, we don't have any, but I think that the biggest thing that has been identified right now is that there's all kinds of pitfalls to making the vaccine mandatory, and the real takeaway, at least for me, has been that there's a lot of definition vagaries that would certainly want to make me turn to somebody like Allie or Stacey before implementing it. The other takeaway that I have from this whole thing is that when there's talk of Congress and congressional efforts to provide COVID liability protection, it's these definition vagaries that make stuff like that important. It's not that it's important to protect employers from getting sued. It's to protect employers who are making good faith effort to comply and to do the right thing from liability. So I still see there's no open questions, which I think is probably indicative of Allie doing a great job.
I try to be thorough, but there's probably going to be questions, and I have my phone number there and my email and Stacey's as well. And so, everyone is just free to reach out if you think of anything afterwards and you're wondering about something specific. Just reach out and we can answer your questions afterwards as well.
Terrific. Well, if there are no questions, I want to thank you both for putting this together for us and for offering it to our members at no charge. That's very much appreciated, and don't be surprised if you hear from a few of our folks.
Great.
That's great. We're glad to do it. Good luck. We know this is a brave new world for everyone. So
yes, it is. Yes,
Okay.
thanks everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.